Far out upon the dark waters where Europe slowly reached toward Asia, there once stood a city that seemed less like a place built by human hands and more like a dream resting between continents. At night, when the sea winds moved gently through the Bosporus and the lanterns flickered along the harbors, Constantinople appeared almost suspended outside of time itself. Ships from distant kingdoms drifted quietly beneath its wall. Bells echoed softly from unseen churches hidden among hills of marble and stone. Traders arriving after weeks at sea would sometimes stand silently upon their decks, staring upward at the glowing domes that shimmered beneath the moonlight like distant stars fallen onto the earth. Long before it became one of the greatest capitals the world had ever known, this narrow strip of land had already captured the imagination of sailors, merchants, emperors, and wandering pilgrims. The city rested at the meeting point of worlds. To the west stretched Europe, filled with forests, kingdoms, and ancient Roman roads disappearing into the horizon. To the east lay Asia, vast and mysterious, where caravans crossed deserts carrying silk, spices, incense, and stories from lands most people would never see. Between them flowed the waters of the Bosporus, deep and dark beneath the night sky, carrying the currents of history itself. Even now, centuries later, there remains something strangely haunting about Constantinople. Perhaps it is because the city survived for so long that it began to feel eternal. Kingdoms rose and disappeared around it like waves breaking against stone, yet Constantinople endured. Armies surrounded it. Fires consumed parts of it. Emperors ruled from golden palaces and vanished into forgotten graves. Still, the city continued watching the sea, year after year, century after century, as though it believed it would never truly fall. And for many people living within its walls, that belief felt almost sacred. Before Constantinople became the heart of an empire, however, it was something much smaller. Long before the great cathedrals, before the imperial processions and candlelit palaces, there stood only a modest settlement known as Byzantium. Greek sailors had founded it many centuries earlier upon these same windswept shores. They quickly understood what made the location extraordinary. Whoever controlled this crossing between continents could watch the movement of ships between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Wealth flowed through these waters endlessly. Grain, silver, wine, silk, and knowledge all passed beneath the gaze of the city. But geography alone could not explain why Constantinople became so powerful. There was another quality hidden within the city, something more difficult to describe. Travelers often wrote that Constantinople felt different from every other place they had ever visited. Some described its golden sunsets spreading across the domes. Others remembered the sound of distant chanting drifting through narrow streets before dawn. Many spoke of the strange sensation that the city belonged equally to two civilizations at once. Roman yet Eastern, Christian yet deeply connected to older worlds, familiar and foreign together. At night especially, Constantinople seemed to transform into something almost dreamlike. Oil lamps flickered outside crowded taverns near the harbors, while monks whispered prayers in candlelit monasteries high upon the hill. Fishermen prepared their nets beneath towers that guarded the sea wall. Somewhere inside the vast imperial palace, exhausted officials studied maps by firelight, while distant guards walked silently through marble corridors polished smooth by generations now long forgotten. And above them all rose the great domes and rooftops of the city itself, glowing softly beneath the moon. Many centuries ago, one emperor looked upon this place and believed he could build a new world here. His name was Constantine. The Roman Empire, old and exhausted, had begun to fracture beneath the weight of its own size. Civil wars scarred the provinces. Political chaos spread through Rome itself. The ancient capital that had once ruled the Mediterranean no longer felt secure. Constantine understood something many others feared to admit. The center of power was shifting eastward, and so he made a decision that would alter history forever. He would abandon the old heart of the empire and create a new capital beside the waters of Byzantium, a city unlike any the world had ever seen, a city that would watch over the meeting of continents, a city that would survive for more than 1,000 years, a city remembered by history as Constantinople. Chapter 1. The emperor who moved the world. The Roman Empire had once seemed eternal. For centuries, its armies had crossed mountains, deserts, forests, and seas beneath banners that carried the authority of Rome into nearly every corner of the known world. Roads stretched across continents like veins of stone. Merchants traveled safely beneath imperial law. Vast cities flourished beneath the protection of Roman power. And at the center of it all stood the ancient capital itself, crowded with temples, senators, monuments, fountains, and memories too numerous for any one person to fully understand. But empires, like all living things, eventually begin to grow tired. By the 4th century, Rome no longer possessed the same certainty it once carried so effortlessly. Civil wars erupted again and again as ambitious generals fought for the imperial throne. Borders weakened beneath constant invasions. Entire provinces suffered from instability, fear, and economic decline. Even within the capital itself, people whispered anxiously about the future. The old confidence of the empire had begun to fade into something heavier and more uncertain. At night, the city of Rome still glowed beneath torchlight and marble, yet many could already sense the slow exhaustion settling into its streets. The empire had simply become too vast. Messages traveled slowly across enormous distances. Armies stationed near the eastern frontiers often received support too late. Political conspiracies spread through the imperial court like shadows moving quietly through candlelight. Emperors rose quickly and disappeared just as quickly, sometimes through betrayal, sometimes through violence, sometimes through the simple collapse of authority itself. And while Rome struggled beneath the weight of its own history, the eastern half of the empire quietly grew richer. Trade routes flowing from Asia carried immense wealth toward the eastern Mediterranean. Cities closer to Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia became increasingly important to the survival of the empire. Grain shipments, spices, silk, gold, and knowledge all moved eastward through ancient roads and sea lanes that connected distant civilizations together. One man understood this transformation more clearly than most. His name was Constantine. He was not simply a soldier or politician. Like many rulers of his age, Constantine possessed ambition large enough to reshape the world around him. Yet there was also something deeply practical in the way he viewed the empire. He understood geography. He understood power. Most importantly, he understood that Rome itself no longer stood at the center of the world it had created. The future belonged elsewhere, somewhere closer to the crossroads of continents, somewhere connected to the great sea routes of the East, somewhere easier to defend, and somewhere new enough to free itself from the endless political burdens that haunted ancient Rome. When Constantine first turned his attention toward the small city of Byzantium, few could have imagined what would rise there in the years ahead. The settlement already possessed advantages impossible to ignore. Surrounded by water on multiple sides, the city occupied one of the most defensible positions in the known world. Ships traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had little choice but to pass nearby. Trade flowed endlessly through the narrow waters of the Bosporus like blood through an artery. But perhaps even more importantly, Byzantium sat between worlds. Europe and Asia faced one another across these waters. Cultures blended here, languages mixed together in crowded markets. Sailors from distant kingdoms shared harbors with merchants carrying goods from deserts thousands of miles away. The city already felt connected to something larger than itself. Constantine saw possibility where others saw only a modest coastal settlement. And so the transformation began. Workers arrived first. Stonecutters, engineers, laborers, architects, sailors, craftsmen, and soldiers slowly gathered beside the ancient walls of Byzantium. Entire shipments of marble crossed the sea. Columns were transported from older cities across the empire. Roads expanded outward from the growing capital like branches spreading from a tree. New forums emerged where merchants and citizens gathered beneath towering statues. Palaces rose beside the sea. Churches appeared among older pagan structures as Christianity slowly gained greater influence across the empire. Day after day, the city changed. At sunrise, the sound of hammers echoed through the streets, while ships unloaded stone at crowded harbors. Dust drifted through the air as enormous construction projects reshaped the skyline itself. At night, workers rested beside oil lamps, while sea winds moved gently through unfinished courtyards overlooking dark waters below. Constantine did not merely want another administrative center. He wanted a new Rome, a capital worthy of imperial greatness, a city capable of carrying the empire forward into an uncertain future. And perhaps, deep within his imagination, he also hoped to build something more lasting than Rome itself. The emperor devoted extraordinary resources toward the project. Grand avenues stretched through the city. Public baths, markets, forums, and administrative buildings appeared rapidly. Great defensive walls protected expanding neighborhoods, while harbors welcomed ships arriving from every direction imaginable. Visitors arriving during these early years often struggled to comprehend the speed of the transformation unfolding before them. What had once been Byzantium slowly disappeared beneath the birth of Constantinople. The new capital reflected Constantine's vision in every detail. Rome had been built gradually over many centuries, shaped by generations of rulers, wars, triumphs, and disasters. Constantinople, however, emerged almost all at once through imperial determination. It carried a strange feeling of freshness rarely found in ancient cities. The streets felt wide and open. The sea seemed present everywhere, and above the growing city rose monuments designed not only to impress citizens, but to convince the world that imperial power itself had been reborn. Christianity also began reshaping the atmosphere of the empire during this period. Constantine's relationship with the faith remains deeply debated even centuries later, yet there is little doubt that his reign transformed Christianity forever. Churches received imperial support. Bishops gained influence. Religious debates once hidden in small communities now affected the entire empire. Constantinople became part political capital and part spiritual center. In candlelit churches overlooking the Bosporus, priests whispered prayers, while outside merchants negotiated prices for silk arriving from the east. Roman law governed the streets, yet Eastern traditions influenced daily life more and more with each passing decade. Greek language and culture blended naturally with imperial Roman authority. The city itself became a meeting place between civilizations, and perhaps that was always its destiny. At night, the transformation felt especially powerful. Lanterns reflected upon dark harbor waters, while guards patrolled the growing sea walls beneath moonlight. Somewhere within the imperial palace, officials studied military reports from distant frontiers while monks copied sacred texts beside flickering candles. Travelers arriving after long voyages often stood silently upon crowded docks, staring upward at the city glowing against the hills above them. Many believed they were witnessing the future of the world, and in many ways they were. Because while old Rome slowly declined beneath the burden of its ancient past, Constantinople stood at the beginning of something entirely new. A city born from ambition, a city balanced between continents, a city destined to outlive empires themselves. Chapter 2, the Golden City of Justinian. By the time Emperor Justinian rose to power, Constantinople had already become one of the richest and most extraordinary cities on earth. Its harbors overflowed with merchant ships from distant kingdoms. Its streets echoed with dozens of languages carried from every direction of the known world. Beneath its growing churches and crowded forums, the city pulsed with ambition, trade, faith, and imperial pride. Yet Justinian dreamed of something even greater. He did not merely wish to preserve the empire he inherited. He wished to restore the lost glory of Rome itself. In his imagination, the old empire could still be reunited beneath a single emperor ruling from Constantinople. North Africa, Italy, and distant western provinces that had fallen into chaos might once again recognize imperial authority. But while Justinian possessed the mind of a ruler, his wife Theodora possessed something equally powerful. She understood people. Theodora's origins were humble compared to the aristocratic families surrounding the imperial throne. Before entering palace life, she had lived among performers, actors, and ordinary citizens far removed from the glittering world of senators and generals. Many members of the elite looked down upon her. Yet within the palace walls, even powerful officials learned to fear her intelligence and determination. Together, Justinian and Theodora formed one of the most remarkable partnerships in Byzantine history. At night, while sea winds drifted across the palace balconies overlooking the Bosporus, the emperor and empress discussed wars, religion, politics, and the future of the empire itself. Servants moved quietly through candlelit corridors carrying maps, reports, and letters from distant provinces. Beyond the palace walls, Constantinople glowed beneath thousands of lanterns scattered across hills facing the sea. The city seemed unstoppable, but beneath the beauty and wealth, tensions were quietly growing. Two powerful factions known as the Blues and the Greens dominated public life within Constantinople. Officially, they supported rival chariot racing teams that competed inside the massive hippodrome near the imperial palace. Yet over time, these factions became something far larger than sports supporters. They evolved into political movements capable of influencing the mood of the entire city. Crowds gathered passionately during races. Citizens shouted, argued, celebrated, and sometimes fought openly beneath the enormous arena wall. Emotions inside the hippodrome could spread quickly into the streets surrounding it. In the winter of 532, those tensions finally erupted. The Nika riots began suddenly, but soon spiraled beyond anyone's control. Fires spread through crowded districts while angry mobs surged through Constantinople's streets. Buildings burned beneath smoke-filled skies. Panic moved rapidly across the capital as citizens feared the city itself might collapse into chaos. Inside the imperial palace, Justinian reportedly considered fleeing. For several terrifying days, the fate of the empire seemed uncertain. Yet Theodora refused surrender. According to later accounts, she reminded the emperor that royal power could not survive cowardice. Better, she suggested, to die as rulers than escape as frightened fugitives. Her determination helped steady the imperial court during its darkest moment. Eventually, imperial forces crushed the uprising with brutal force inside the hippodrome itself. When silence finally returned to Constantinople, much of the city lay damaged or destroyed. But from those ashes, Justinian prepared to build something magnificent. Among the ruined districts stood the remains of an older church destroyed during the riots. Justinian decided its replacement would surpass every structure ever built in the Christian world. And so the Hagia Sophia began to rise. Thousands of workers gathered beneath towering scaffolds that climbed into the sky above Constantinople. Marble arrived from distant provinces across the empire. Engineers studied impossible designs. Craftsmen shaped stone beneath the glow of oil lamps, while priests prayed that the great structure would stand for generations. Day after day, the massive dome slowly emerged above the city skyline. Citizens watched in amazement. Sailors approaching Constantinople from the sea could already see the growing cathedral dominating the hills long before reaching the harbor. At sunrise, the dome reflected pale golden light across the Bosporus. At night, its silhouette stood against the darkness like something suspended between earth and heaven. When Hagia Sophia was finally completed, many who entered struggled to describe what they felt. Light poured through enormous windows beneath the dome, creating the illusion that the ceiling itself floated above the earth. Incense drifted softly through the cathedral, while choirs echoed against walls covered in marble and gold. Candles flickered endlessly beneath towering arches that seemed almost too vast for human understanding. For many citizens, entering Hagia Sophia felt like stepping into another world entirely. And for Justinian, it became the ultimate symbol of Constantinople's greatness. Beyond the cathedral walls, daily life continued flowing through the city with restless energy. Merchants crowded the markets selling silk from China, spices from Arabia, ivory from Africa, and wine from the islands of the Mediterranean. Fishermen unloaded fresh catches near the harbors before sunrise, while bakers prepared bread for busy streets already filling with travelers, laborers, priests, and sailors. The city smelled of salt air, incense, smoke, and distant kitchens. At night, taverns near the docks glowed with lantern light, while musicians played softly beside crowded tables. Sailors exchanged stories from distant voyages as rain tapped gently against stone alleyways outside. Somewhere deeper within the city, monks copied manuscripts beside candles, while guards patrolled silent palace corridors overlooking the sea. Constantinople never truly slept. Even in darkness, the city remained alive with whispers, footsteps, bells, and moving shadows. Yet beneath all its wealth and beauty, Constantinople also became a city of secrets. Imperial diplomats negotiated carefully with foreign kingdoms while spies carried information quietly across borders and harbors. Silk production, once controlled entirely by distant Eastern powers, slowly became a guarded imperial industry within Byzantine territory itself. Trade routes brought not only riches, but rumors, ambitions, and dangers from every direction imaginable. The empire survived through intelligence as much as military strength. And at the center of it all stood Constantinople, watching the movement of the world from beside its dark waters. As evening settled over the Bosporus, countless candles began appearing across the hills of the city. Their reflections shimmered softly upon the sea. From high towers and monastery windows, the lights seemed endless. Somewhere beyond the harbor walls, ships drifted quietly through the darkness while cold sea winds moved through narrow streets paved with ancient stone. And above the sleeping city rose the great dome of Hagia Sophia, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight. For a moment, Constantinople appeared eternal, a golden city balanced between continents, a place where emperors dreamed of restoring Rome itself, a place where ordinary citizens walked beneath wonders unlike anything the world had ever seen. And though future centuries would bring wars, betrayals, fires, invasions, and heartbreak, there remained something unforgettable about this age of Constantinople, because for a brief moment in history, the city truly became the center of the world. Chapter 3, The Walls That Defied the World Long After Emperors Died, and Generations Disappeared into Forgotten Graves. The walls of Constantinople continued standing beside the sea. They rose across the land in massive layers of stone, stretching mile after mile between the Marmara shoreline and the waters of the Golden Horn. Travelers approaching the city for the first time often fell silent when they saw them. Tower after tower climbed above deep defensive trenches, while enormous gates guarded the roads leading toward the imperial capital. In rain, the walls looked dark and endless beneath storm clouds. At sunrise, pale golden light touched the stone as if the city itself were waking slowly from sleep. For centuries, these defenses protected Constantinople from armies that would have destroyed nearly any other city in the world. The Theodosian walls, named after Emperor Theodosius II, became one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient age. Built in multiple defensive layers, they transformed Constantinople into a fortress, unlike anything Europe or Asia had ever seen. Even powerful rulers arriving with enormous armies sometimes stared upward at the walls and quietly wondered if victory was truly possible. Behind them stood not merely a city, but an empire, and beyond the walls stretched the uncertain world. At night, soldiers patrolled narrow stone walkways high above the earth, while cold sea winds drifted inland from the Bosporus. Torches flickered beside towers overlooking dark fields beyond the city. Somewhere far below, waves moved softly against harbor walls while distant church bells echoed faintly through sleeping streets. The walls never truly rested. Even during peaceful years, guards remained alert. Messengers arrived carrying reports of invasions, rebellions, migrating tribes, and rising kingdoms beyond the frontiers. The empire understood something deeply unsettling about its own survival. Constantinople was wealthy because the world desired its riches, and the world was dangerous because countless rulers desired the city itself. Again and again, armies appeared outside the gates. Some came from the deserts of the south carrying curved swords and banners moving beneath hot wind. Others emerged from forests and plains in the north, their campfires spreading across the horizon at night like distant constellations. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders, and countless others eventually marched toward Constantinople hoping to claim the city for themselves. Most failed. The walls endured siege after siege with almost supernatural resilience. For the citizens living safely behind them, the distant presence of enemy armies became a strange part of life itself. Farmers from nearby villages crowded into the city whenever invasions approached. Markets prepared for shortages. Churches filled with anxious worshippers whispering prayers beside candlelight. Yet even during dangerous moments, many citizens continued believing Constantinople could never truly fall. The walls had protected them for too long. Surely they always would. Outside the city, however, invading armies often faced exhaustion and despair. Siege camps became miserable places during long winters. Rain turned roads into deep mud while disease spread through crowded tents. Supplies vanished quickly. Cold winds swept inward from the sea during endless nights beneath the looming shadow of Constantinople's towers. And above everything stood the silent walls themselves, watching, waiting. Among the empire's most terrifying defenses was a mysterious weapon known only as Greek fire. Even centuries later, historians still debate exactly how it worked. The formula remained one of Byzantium's greatest secrets, guarded carefully by imperial authorities. What enemies understood clearly, however, was the horrifying effect it produced during naval battle. Greek fire burned upon water. Enemy ships approaching Constantinople sometimes saw flames racing suddenly across the sea itself beneath clouds of smoke and screaming panic. Byzantine vessels launched the weapon through bronze tubes mounted near their prows, while terrified sailors struggled desperately to escape the spreading fire. At night, these battles must have appeared almost unreal. Dark waves reflected burning ships while smoke drifted across moonlit water near the harbor entrances. Bells rang from the city walls above as citizens watched the chaos unfolding below. To many enemies, Constantinople no longer seemed protected merely by soldiers and stone. It seemed protected by something divine. Winter brought its own quiet hardships to the defenders guarding the wall. Snow occasionally covered the towers while freezing winds swept across the ramparts, overlooking empty fields beyond the city. Soldiers wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks beside small fires burning within guard chambers hidden inside the fortifications. Some stared silently into the darkness for hours, listening for distant movement beyond the frozen trenches below. The loneliness could feel endless, yet life continued even during the coldest nights. Messengers climbed narrow staircases carrying orders between towers. Priests visited soldiers before dawn prayer. Somewhere within the sleeping city, bakers prepared warm bread, while fishermen ventured carefully into icy waters before sunrise. Constantinople survived because ordinary people continued living despite fear. That quiet endurance mattered as much as the walls themselves. Over time, many citizens began believing their city existed beneath divine protection. Stories spread through Constantinople describing miracles during sieges. Some claimed heavenly figures appeared above the walls during moments of terrible danger. Others believed the Virgin Mary herself guarded the capital from destruction. Whether true or not, these beliefs strengthened the spirit of the population during generations shaped by uncertainty and war. The city became more than an imperial capital. It became an idea, a symbol of endurance against chaos. and for centuries that belief proved almost impossible to destroy. Then morning would arrive once more across the Bosporus. Fog drifted slowly above the sea while church bells echoed across the waking city. Sunlight touched the great walls after long nights of cold winds and silent watchfulness. Merchants reopened their stalls, ships entered the harbors, priests carried incense through candlelit sanctuaries, while guards changed positions atop towers overlooking the world beyond. And still Constantinople remained standing, a city of stone, faith, and extraordinary survival, a city that refused to surrender to time itself. Chapter 4: Life inside the Queen of Cities. When travelers wrote about Constantinople, they often described its walls, its emperors, or its towering churches first. Yet the true heart of the city lived elsewhere. It lived in the ordinary rhythms that unfolded each morning beneath the golden domes and crowded rooftops. It lived in the sounds of footsteps along wet marble streets before dawn, in the warmth rising from bakeries beside narrow alleys, in the distant bells drifting across the sea while fishermen prepared their boats beneath fading stars. For all its grandeur, Constantinople was still a city filled with human routines. And perhaps that was what made it unforgettable. As sunrise spread slowly across the Bosporus, bathhouses throughout the city began filling with life. Steam drifted through wide chambers lined with polished stone, while attendants carried buckets of heated water beneath glowing lamps. Merchants discussed trade beside rising clouds of warmth. Soldiers rested aching muscles after long watches upon the walls. Old men spoke quietly about politics while younger citizens listened carefully, learning how power moved through the empire. The bathhouses were not simply places for washing. They were places where the city breathed. Outside, cold sea winds swept through narrow streets. But inside the baths, the atmosphere remained warm and heavy with conversation, water, and flickering light. Echoes moved softly through domed ceilings, while droplets gathered upon marble columns worn smooth by generations of hands. Even emperors understood the importance of these spaces. In Constantinople, daily life itself became part of the empire's strength. Far above the busy streets stood the monasteries. Hidden behind stone walls and candlelit courtyards, monks lived lives shaped by silence, prayer, and discipline. Some monasteries overlooked the sea from high hills, where the sound of harbor crowds faded into distant murmurs below. Others rested deeper within the city, tucked between crowded neighborhoods and ancient churches. At night, their candles glowed softly behind narrow windows. The monks copied manuscripts carefully by hand, while rain tapped gently against rooftops outside. Hours passed quietly beneath the scratching of ink across parchment. Some texts preserved ancient philosophy from Greece and Rome. Others carried sacred prayers repeated endlessly across generations. In many ways, the monasteries became guardians of memory itself. While wars reshaped kingdoms beyond the walls, these quiet communities preserved knowledge beneath flickering candlelight. And through the darkness of countless nights, chants echoed softly from hidden chapels overlooking Constantinople. The city also contained libraries unlike anywhere else in the medieval world. Within palace collections and scholarly centers rested thousands of texts gathered across centuries of imperial history. Philosophers, historians, astronomers, physicians, and theologians all contributed to the intellectual life of Constantinople. Students crossed enormous distances hoping to study within the empire's capital. Some arrived from distant provinces carrying little more than worn clothing and handwritten notes. Others traveled aboard merchant vessels from foreign kingdoms where rumors of Byzantine learning had spread for generations. Inside the libraries, the atmosphere felt almost sacred. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight while scholars turned fragile pages carefully beneath deep silence. Shelves carried voices from vanished civilizations. Ancient Greece still whispered through philosophy and poetry preserved within the city's walls. Outside, markets roared with life and politics shifted constantly. Inside, time seemed slower. Imperial ceremonies revealed another side of Constantinople entirely. Within vast palace halls covered in gold mosaics and colored marble, ambassadors from foreign kingdoms waited nervously beneath enormous ceilings reflecting candlelight in every direction. Silk curtains moved gently beside open windows overlooking the sea, while guards wearing polished armor stood motionless beside towering doors. The emperor's arrival itself became theater. Musicians played softly. Officials announced titles stretching endlessly through the hall. Incense drifted through the air, while foreign visitors struggled to comprehend the overwhelming spectacle surrounding them. Everything within the palace existed for a purpose. Constantinople wanted the world to believe the empire remained eternal, and for many visitors, it worked. Down near the harbors, however, life felt louder and less controlled. The docks never truly slept. Ships arrived from Egypt carrying grain. Others brought spices, ivory, silk, wine, timber, or precious metals from lands most citizens would never see themselves. Sailors shouted across crowded piers while cranes unloaded cargo beneath circling seabirds. Tavern doors opened before sunset and remained, crowded long into the night. The smell of salt water mixed with smoke, fish, damp rope, and unfamiliar spices drifting through the harbor districts. Here the empire touched the wider world directly. Languages blended together constantly. Greek merchants bargained beside Arab sailors, while travelers from northern kingdoms listened carefully to stories carried from distant seas and deserts. The harbors made Constantinople feel endless. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens filled the marketplaces scattered throughout the city. Bread sellers called out to passing crowds, while women carried baskets through narrow streets lined with workshops and food stalls. Bakers prepared warm loaves before sunrise. Wine merchants stacked clay jars beside hanging lanterns. Children moved through crowded alleys chasing one another beneath laundry hanging overhead. Daily life unfolded with comforting repetition. Morning bells, fresh bread, street musicians, distant prayers, footsteps echoing across wet stone after rainfall. Even during difficult years, these small routines continued. Then night slowly returned to Constantinople once more. Lanterns appeared beside windows overlooking dark streets, while cold fog drifted inward from the Bosporus. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed softly across the hills. Monks whispered evening prayers behind monastery walls. Tavern laughter faded gradually into silence near the docks. Above the sleeping city rose the great domes and towers, glowing faintly beneath moonlight. And through narrow alleyways and quiet courtyards, the Queen of Cities rested beside the sea, not merely as an imperial capital, but as a living world filled with ordinary souls moving gently through history itself. Chapter 5: Emperors, Intrigue, and Sacred Power. Beyond the crowded markets and harbor districts of Constantinople stood another world entirely. Hidden behind guarded gates and enormous walls stretched the Great Palace, a vast imperial complex overlooking the waters of the Bosporus. To ordinary citizens, the palace seemed almost mythical. Rumors drifted endlessly through the city about golden halls, secret chambers, hidden gardens, sacred relics, and corridors so enormous that visitors could lose themselves for hours beneath their shadowed ceiling. At night, the palace glowed softly above the sleeping capital. Torches flickered beside marble stairways, while guards moved silently through long passageways polished by generations of imperial footsteps. Sea winds carried the scent of rain inward from the harbor below. Somewhere deep inside the complex, servants prepared late meals while officials studied military reports arriving from distant frontiers. Yet beneath all its beauty, the palace was also a place of fear, because in Constantinople, power rarely rested peacefully. The emperor ruled the empire, but countless invisible figures shaped the palace around him. Among the most influential were the eunuchs, men trusted with responsibilities too sensitive for ordinary officials. Many served within the imperial court for decades, carrying messages, guarding private chambers, organizing ceremonies, and quietly observing the endless flow of politics moving through the palace. They understood secrets better than almost anyone else. In candlelit corridors hidden behind ceremonial halls, whispered conversations often determined the future of provinces, generals, and even emperors themselves. Alliances formed quietly over shared meals and disappeared just as quickly through betrayal or suspicion. No ruler within Constantinople could ever fully relax. Too many eyes watched the throne. At night, rain sometimes struck the palace windows, while distant thunder rolled across the Bosporus. Inside, officials walked silently through narrow passageways carrying sealed letters beneath flickering lamps. Somewhere nearby, powerful families plotted marriages capable of shifting influence throughout the empire. The palace appeared magnificent from the outside. Inside, it often felt deeply lonely. To wear the imperial crown of Constantinople was to carry the weight of an entire civilization. Emperors did not simply govern cities or armies. They ruled over trade routes stretching across continents, religious disputes shaping millions of lives, and military frontiers constantly threatened by invasion. Every decision echoed outward through provinces separated by mountains, deserts, forests, and seas. Many emperors began their reigns with confidence. Some imagined themselves chosen by destiny. But over time, the pressure of authority slowly changed them. The palace demanded endless attention. Reports arrived constantly from distant borders. Tax disputes, military crises, religious disagreements, conspiracies, famines, rebellions, and diplomatic tensions all flowed toward the imperial court like rivers emptying into the sea. And above everything lingered the fear of failure, because Constantinople rarely forgave weakness. At formal ceremonies, the emperor appeared almost divine beneath golden robes and jeweled crowns. Crowds bowed, priests offered blessings. Musicians filled enormous halls with echoes of imperial grandeur. Yet behind those rituals stood human beings often exhausted by isolation. Many rulers spent sleepless nights, staring across dark waters beyond the palace balconies, wondering how long the empire could continue surviving beneath its endless burdens. Religion added another layer of tension to the life of the city. The people of Constantinople cared deeply about matters of faith, sometimes with astonishing intensity. Debates about theology spread far beyond churches and monasteries into marketplaces, taverns, and ordinary homes. Questions about the nature of Christ, sacred authority, and church doctrine occasionally divided entire regions of the empire. Words themselves became dangerous. Priests argued passionately before crowded audiences, while emperors struggled to maintain unity among deeply divided populations. Councils gathered within enormous halls where bishops debated for days beneath clouds of incense and candle smoke. Outside, citizens discussed the arguments in busy streets as though the future of the world depended upon them. And perhaps, in their minds, it did. Constantinople believed itself chosen to defend true faith. That belief gave the empire strength, but it also created conflict capable of shaking the foundations of society itself. Within the palace, betrayal often arrived quietly. A trusted advisor might suddenly disappear after accusations whispered behind silk curtains. A general celebrated one month could face imprisonment the next. Poison, exile, and conspiracy became familiar parts of imperial history. Even family members sometimes turned against one another when succession to the throne became uncertain. Fear moved silently through the palace like smoke. Servants learned not to repeat overheard conversations. Officials measured every word carefully during court gatherings. Ambitious nobles studied the shifting balance of influence constantly, searching for advantage while avoiding dangerous alliances. The beauty of the palace concealed endless tension. Golden mosaics reflected candlelight across rooms filled with suspicion and guarded smiles. And somewhere beyond the windows, Constantinople itself continued living beneath the illusion of stability. For many emperors, loneliness became unavoidable. Though surrounded by servants, guards, advisors, priests, and courtiers, rulers often trusted very few people completely. The higher they rose within imperial life, the smaller their world sometimes became. Some found comfort in religion. Others devoted themselves obsessively to military campaigns or palace reforms. A few simply withdrew into silence. Late at night, emperors sometimes walked alone through quiet balconies overlooking the Bosporus, while cold winds moved across the water below. Ships drifted through darkness, carrying merchants and travelers unaware that the ruler of the empire stood awake above them, burdened by decisions no ordinary citizen could fully imagine. Constantinople demanded greatness from its emperors, but greatness carried a terrible cost, and so the palace remained illuminated through countless nights beside the sea. Candles burned within hidden chambers, while distant bells echoed softly across the sleeping city. Guards continued their silent patrols beneath marble archways. Somewhere within the enormous complex, another emperor studied maps beneath flickering light while rain whispered against the windows overlooking Constantinople. Outside, the city still appeared eternal, but inside the palace, those closest to power understood a quieter truth. Empires were fragile things, and beneath the gold, silk, ceremony, and sacred authority of Constantinople rested human fear, ambition, exhaustion, and longing, the same emotions carried by every civilization throughout history. Even the greatest city in the world could not escape them. Chapter 6. The Crusaders and the Shattered Empire. For centuries, Constantinople had watched foreign armies gather beyond its walls. Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and countless others had approached the imperial city as enemies. Yet by the beginning of the 13th century, a different kind of army began moving slowly toward the Bosporus from the west. These men called themselves Crusaders. They carried crosses stitched onto heavy cloaks and shields darkened by long journeys across Europe. Many believed they were marching eastward in service of God, hoping to reclaim sacred lands from Muslim control. Priests blessed their banners before departure, while church bells rang across distant villages as thousands prepared for war. But when Western Crusaders first entered Constantinople, the relationship between the two Christian worlds already felt uneasy. The Byzantines viewed many Western Europeans as rough, impulsive, and dangerously unpredictable. Western Crusaders, meanwhile, often regarded Constantinople with suspicion and jealousy. The city's immense wealth astonished them. Its churches glittered with gold. Its markets overflowed with luxuries unfamiliar to much of medieval Europe. Some crusaders stared at the imperial capital with admiration. Others stared with hunger. At night, their camps spread beyond the city walls while torchlight flickered across armor wet from sea mist drifting inland from the Bosporus. From high towers, Byzantine guards watched silently as thousands of Western soldiers settled uneasily outside the Queen of Cities. Few yet understood how deeply history was about to change. At first, the empire attempted cooperation. Byzantine emperors understood the strategic importance of the Crusades and occasionally provided ships, supplies, or military support to Western armies moving through imperial territory. Yet mistrust poisoned nearly every interaction between the two sides. Cultural differences felt impossible to ignore. The Byzantines spoke Greek, followed Eastern Christian traditions, and viewed themselves as heirs to ancient Rome. Western crusaders arrived from feudal kingdoms shaped by Latin Christianity, harsh warfare, and very different customs. Even simple conversations sometimes carried tension beneath polite diplomacy. Inside Constantinople, citizens watched the foreigners carefully. Some merchants welcomed the business they brought. Tavern owners near the harbors earned fortunes serving restless soldiers preparing for further campaigns eastward. Yet many residents felt uneasy seeing so many armed strangers gathering near the capital. Whispers spread through crowded streets. Could these Western armies truly be trusted? The answer slowly became clear. By 1203, the Fourth Crusade approached Constantinople itself. Political chaos inside the Byzantine Empire had created an opportunity impossible for ambitious leaders to ignore. Crusader forces, heavily influenced by Venetian interests and imperial disputes, turned their attention toward the city they were never supposed to attack. The sight must have felt almost unreal. Christian soldiers marching beneath crosses, now prepared to threaten the greatest Christian city in the Eastern world. From the walls of Constantinople, citizens watched fleets gathering across dark waters while armored camps spread across the horizon. Church bells rang throughout the city as fear slowly tightened its grip upon the population. Many still believed the walls would protect them. They always had before. But this time, the danger felt different. This was not merely another foreign invasion. It was betrayal. When violence finally erupted, Constantinople descended into nightmare. Fires spread rapidly through crowded districts while smoke darkened the sky above the city. The sounds of screaming, collapsing buildings, church bells, and clashing steel echoed through streets once filled with merchants and pilgrims. Citizens fled carrying whatever possessions they could save, while terrified families searched desperately for safety among collapsing neighborhoods. Flames reflected across the Bosporus at night. Entire sections of the city burned beneath clouds of ash drifting through the air like black snow. From distant monasteries came frightened prayers, while soldiers fought desperately among narrow streets glowing red beneath the firelight. The Queen of Cities, which had survived centuries of invasion, now suffered devastation from fellow Christians. And perhaps that made the pain feel even worse. Churches became targets. Sacred spaces once filled with incense, candlelight, and whispered prayers were stripped of treasures gathered across generations. Gold disappeared from altars. Holy relics vanished into Western hands. Horses reportedly entered sanctuaries that citizens once believed stood under divine protection. For many Byzantines, the emotional wound reached far beyond military defeat. Something sacred had been broken. The divide between Eastern and Western Christianity, already fragile for centuries, shattered almost completely beneath the violence of the sack. Inside Hagia Sophia itself, fear and disbelief spread among worshippers listening helplessly to chaos unfolding outside. The cathedral that once symbolized the glory of Christian civilization now witnessed the collapse of unity within the Christian world itself. And above the city, smoke continued rising into the darkened sky. Ordinary citizens suffered terribly. Families lost homes, businesses, and loved ones during the violence. Refugees crowded churches and surviving neighborhoods searching for food and shelter, while armed crusaders moved through streets heavy with destruction. Many who survived later described the emotional shock of seeing Constantinople humiliated after centuries of imperial greatness. The city no longer felt invincible. That realization changed everything. At night, the streets grew quieter than before. Entire districts stood damaged or abandoned. Burned buildings remained beside shattered churches, while sea winds carried the smell of smoke through the ruined capital. Some citizens wept openly during prayers. Others simply stared silently at the destruction surrounding them. The empire itself seemed wounded in spirit. Though Byzantium would eventually reclaim Constantinople years later, the city never fully recovered from the Fourth Crusade. The sack left scars deeper than damaged buildings or stolen treasures. Trade weakened, political stability fractured, trust between East and West collapsed almost beyond repair. The empire that once dominated the Mediterranean slowly entered a long period of decline from which it would never completely escape. And yet, even after devastation, Constantinople still endured. Morning sunlight continued touching the harbor waters. Church bells still echoed across the hills. Merchants slowly returned to damaged markets while monks relit candles within surviving monasteries. Life persisted beside sorrow, but something fragile had changed forever inside the heart of the city. For the first time in centuries, Constantinople no longer seemed eternal. The Queen of Cities had survived, yet now she carried wounds that time itself would never fully heal. Chapter 7, The Long Twilight of Byzantium. After the devastation of the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople still stood beside the Bosporus, but the empire surrounding it had changed forever. The city that once ruled enormous territories stretching across the Mediterranean now governed only fragments of its former greatness. Provinces that had once supplied wealth, soldiers, grain, and taxes slowly disappeared into the hands of rival kingdoms and rising powers. Trade weakened, political authority fractured. Even the harbors, once crowded endlessly with ships from every direction of the known world, sometimes felt quieter than before. Yet Constantinople refused to surrender its memory of greatness. The ancient walls still guarded the city. Hagia Sophia still rose above the skyline beneath drifting clouds and pale sunlight. Priests continued chanting within candlelit churches, while emperors still wore ceremonial crowns during sacred processions through the capital. But beneath the rituals lingered exhaustion. The empire had become smaller, older, and deeply fragile. Citizens walking through the streets could still see beauty everywhere: marble columns, golden mosaics, harbor sunsets glowing upon dark waters. Yet many also sensed the slow fading of something once enormous. Empty buildings appeared beside busy neighborhoods. Some palace halls no longer carried the same splendor they once possessed. Wealthy families guarded shrinking fortunes while ordinary citizens struggled through uncertain years shaped by fear and decline. The city remembered its greatness constantly, and perhaps that memory made the sorrow even heavier. Beyond the empire's borders, a new power slowly began rising. The Ottomans first appeared as one of many Turkish states emerging across Anatolia. Yet over time they grew stronger, more organized, and increasingly ambitious. Byzantine emperors watched carefully as Ottoman armies expanded territory year after year, capturing towns, trade routes, and strategic fortresses once connected to imperial authority. At first, some citizens believed the danger could still be controlled. After all, Constantinople had survived countless enemies before, but this threat continued growing steadily with each passing generation. Ottoman banners appeared closer to Byzantine lands. Travelers arriving by sea carried troubling reports about disciplined armies and powerful new rulers determined to build an empire of their own. Villages near the frontiers disappeared quietly beneath Ottoman control, while exhausted Byzantine officials searched desperately for alliances capable of slowing the advance. At night, the sea winds still moved gently across Constantinople's rooftop. Yet beneath the familiar sounds of harbor bells and distant prayers, anxiety spread quietly through the city. The empire's treasury suffered terribly during these final centuries. Wars, political instability, and shrinking territory reduced imperial wealth dramatically. Maintaining the enormous capital became increasingly difficult. Some defensive walls crumbled slowly without proper repairs. Palace ceremonies remained grand in appearance, but behind the silk curtains and golden mosaics, many officials understood how fragile the empire had become. Foreign merchants gained greater influence over trade flowing through the city. Venetian and Genoese ships dominated sections of the harbors, while Byzantine authority weakened economically as well as militarily. Citizens who remembered older generations spoke quietly about how much richer and more powerful Constantinople once felt. The contrast haunted the city. Ancient monuments still surrounded the population, reminding everyone of centuries when emperors commanded vast armies and enormous wealth. Yet daily reality no longer matched those memories. Even the streets sometimes carried a quieter atmosphere. Fewer celebrations, fewer grand processions, more uncertainty. Diplomacy became one of Byzantium's last remaining weapons. Emperors sent envoys westward searching for military assistance from European kingdoms and the Catholic Church. Negotiations stretched across years filled with complicated promises, religious disagreements, and political hesitation. Some Western rulers sympathized with Constantinople's situation. Others remained distracted by their own wars and ambition. Inside the imperial palace, officials studied maps beneath flickering candlelight while reports arrived describing Ottoman victories nearby. The empire no longer possessed the strength to confront its enemies directly with confidence. Instead, it survived through fragile treaties, careful negotiations, and the hope that rival powers might delay disaster. But deep within the city, many citizens already sensed what approached. Constantinople was waiting for help, waiting for war, waiting for history to decide its fate. Meanwhile, the monasteries continued their quiet existence beside the sea. Monks copied sacred texts beneath candlelight just as generations before them had done. Incense drifted softly through chapel halls while evening prayers echoed against ancient stone walls. Outside, autumn rain sometimes fell gently across the city, while cold winds moved through narrow alleyways overlooking the Bosporus. In these final centuries, the monasteries seemed almost suspended outside time. While the empire weakened politically, spiritual life within Constantinople remained deeply rooted in ritual and memory. Pilgrims still visited holy sites. Priests still carried candles through darkened sanctuaries. Church bells still rang across the hills at dawn and dusk. Yet even here the shadow of decline could not be ignored completely. Some monasteries struggled financially. Others watched nearby districts grow poorer and quieter with each passing decade. Still, the prayers continued, and through everything, Constantinople remembered. The city remembered Justinian and Hagia Sophia. It remembered victorious emperors, crowded harbors, triumphal ceremonies, and centuries when the empire seemed eternal. Ancient statues still watched silently over public squares, while enormous walls continued facing outward toward a changing world. At sunset, the city often looked almost unchanged from earlier ages. Golden light spread across the dome. Ships drifted slowly through the Bosporus. Bells echoed softly over the sea while smoke rose from evening fires preparing meals within crowded homes. Yet beneath the beauty lingered melancholy. Constantinople had become a civilization living partly within memory itself. A city still magnificent, still sacred, still alive, but slowly surrounded by the growing silence of an ending world. Chapter 8, The Last Night of Constantinople. By the spring of 1453, everyone inside Constantinople understood that the end was approaching. The empire that had once ruled across continents had been reduced almost entirely to the city itself. Beyond the ancient walls stretched the growing power of the Ottoman Empire, and at its head stood a young ruler whose ambition seemed almost limitless. His name was Mehmed II. Though still young, Mehmed carried enormous determination within him. He studied military strategy obsessively and dreamed of conquering the city that generations of rulers before him had failed to capture. To the Ottomans, Constantinople was more than a prize of war. It was the final gateway between worlds, the last great remnant of the Roman Empire standing against the future now rising in the east. From his camp outside the city, Mehmed could already see the great domes and towers rising above the walls beneath pale spring skies. For centuries, those walls had protected Constantinople from nearly every enemy imaginable. Now the young sultan intended to break them forever. At night, Ottoman campfires stretched across the landscape, surrounding the city like endless constellations glowing beneath the darkness. Thousands of soldiers prepared quietly beside tents moving softly in the cold sea wind. Horses stamped against damp earth while distant prayers drifted upward through the camps before dawn. Inside Constantinople, church bells answered from beyond the walls. The two worlds stood facing one another in silence. The cannons arrived slowly. Gigantic weapons unlike anything the city had ever faced were dragged across the countryside by enormous teams of animals and laborers. Citizens watching from the walls stared uneasily as the massive guns took position outside Constantinople. Some defenders had heard rumors already. These cannons could shatter stone itself. Soon the bombardment began. The sound rolled across the city with terrifying force, echoing through churches, marketplaces, monasteries, and palace halls alike. Ancient walls that had resisted armies for centuries trembled beneath the repeated explosion. Dust drifted downward from towers, while citizens gathered anxiously in the streets listening to the thunder beyond the gates. Day after day, the bombardment continued. At night, workers rushed desperately to repair damaged sections of the walls beneath torchlight, while exhausted soldiers stood guard above them. Priests moved among the defenders offering prayers and blessings while cold spring rain occasionally swept across the city from the sea. Constantinople had survived countless sieges before, but this time felt different. Even the walls seemed tired. Inside the city, ordinary life slowly transformed into quiet survival. Food became scarcer. Fear spread carefully through crowded neighborhoods where families whispered anxiously behind closed doors. Some citizens still tried to continue daily routines. Bakers prepared bread before sunrise. Fishermen ventured cautiously into the harbor when conditions allowed. Monks maintained prayers within candlelit monasteries overlooking the Bosporus. Yet beneath every ordinary moment lingered the awareness that history itself was approaching its final hour. At night, the city grew strangely quiet between bombardments. Citizens gathered in churches illuminated by trembling candlelight while distant cannon fire echoed beyond the walls. Mothers held sleeping children close beneath blankets, while elderly citizens prayed softly beside fading oil lamps. Somewhere in the darkness, soldiers walked silently across damaged ramparts, staring toward the Ottoman fires surrounding Constantinople on every side. The city no longer felt like the center of the world. It felt like a civilization holding its final breath. Still, many refused to abandon hope. Some believed divine intervention would save Constantinople at the last moment, just as legends claimed it had before. Others simply could not imagine a world in which the Queen of Cities truly disappeared. And so the waiting continued. At the center of the crisis stood Emperor Constantine XI. He ruled an empire already collapsing long before the siege began, yet many later remembered him with deep admiration because he refused to abandon the city during its final days. While some advisors discussed escape, Constantine chose to remain beside his people and defenders. Perhaps he understood that the emperor and the city now shared the same fate. During the siege, he moved constantly through Constantinople inspecting defenses, encouraging soldiers, meeting commanders, and praying within churches darkened by uncertainty. Witnesses described him as calm despite the growing hopelessness surrounding the city. Yet behind that calm must have existed enormous sorrow. He knew the history resting upon his shoulders. More than 1,000 years of emperors, victories, ceremonies, prayers, and imperial memory now approached their end beneath the thunder of Ottoman cannons. Late at night, Constantine reportedly walked the walls overlooking the enemy camps flickering across the darkness beyond. Cold winds moved through damaged towers, while distant voices echoed faintly across the fields outside the city. Somewhere beyond the walls waited an army preparing to change history forever. And somewhere inside himself, perhaps the emperor already understood that Constantinople could not survive much longer. Then came the final prayer in Hagia Sophia. Citizens gathered beneath the enormous dome, while candles illuminated the cathedral with soft golden light one last time. Priests carried incense through the crowded sanctuary, while chants echoed upward into the vast darkness above. The atmosphere felt heavy with grief and exhaustion. For centuries, Hagia Sophia had stood as the spiritual heart of Byzantine civilization. Emperors had been crowned beneath its dome. Victories had been celebrated there. Entire generations had whispered prayers within its walls during moments of fear, hope, celebration, and sorrow. Now the city gathered together beneath the cathedral, knowing that morning might bring the end of everything they had ever known. Rich and poor stood side by side. Soldiers prayed beside merchants. Monks stood beside frightened families. Some wept openly while others remained silent, staring upward toward the dim light shimmering across ancient mosaics hidden within the shadow. Outside, the Ottoman camps waited beneath the night sky. Inside, Constantinople said farewell to itself. Before dawn on May 29, 1453, the final assault began. The sound of drums and shouting rose from the darkness beyond the walls, while defenders rushed toward damaged fortifications beneath torchlight and smoke. Cannons thundered again. Arrows and stones filled the air. Exhausted soldiers fought desperately across broken sections of wall that had guarded the city for centuries. Then slowly, almost unbelievably, the defenses began collapsing. Ottoman forces surged through breaches, while panic spread rapidly through parts of the city. Bells rang desperately across Constantinople as citizens fled through narrow streets already filling with confusion and terror. Some defenders continued fighting until the very end. Among them was Constantine XI himself. Accounts differ about his final moments, but many believed the emperor died defending the city rather than surrendering it. If true, it meant the last Roman emperor disappeared into battle beside the final ruins of his empire, and with him ended more than 1,000 years of Byzantine civilization. Morning arrived quietly over Constantinople. Smoke drifted upward into pale skies, while exhausted survivors emerged slowly into streets transformed forever. Ottoman banners now rose above towers that had once carried the symbols of Byzantium. The long age of the Eastern Roman Empire had ended, yet the city itself remained. Ships still floated upon the Bosporus. Sunlight still touched the domes and harbor waters. Church bells had fallen silent, but the sea winds continued moving gently through the streets as they always had before. Mehmed entered the conquered city carefully. Unlike many invaders throughout history, he understood the importance of what he had captured. Constantinople was not merely another defeated city. It was one of the great capitals of human civilization. And though the Byzantine world had fallen, the city would continue living beneath a new empire. Its name would slowly change, its rulers would change, its faith and culture would evolve across centuries ahead. But beneath everything, the ancient heart of Constantinople endured beside the waters between Europe and Asia, watching history continue long after empires themselves disappeared. Conclusion: the city that never truly disappeared. Centuries have passed since the fall of Constantinople, yet the city never truly vanished. Today its streets carry a different name. Modern ferries cross the Bosporus where imperial ships once drifted beneath Byzantine banners. Crowded avenues now fill spaces where ancient forums stood beneath marble columns. The voices echoing through the city have changed across time, blending new languages, cultures, prayers, and generations together beneath the same restless sky. And still, beneath modern Istanbul, the old city remains. Sometimes it appears quietly in forgotten corners, a broken wall hidden between busy neighborhoods, a faded mosaic surviving beneath layers of history, ancient stones resting beneath crowded streets where millions walk each year without realizing how many footsteps came before their own. The city carries its past the way the sea carries reflections, never fully holding them still, yet never completely letting them disappear either. At dawn, the Bosporus still glows beneath soft light exactly as it did centuries ago. Cold winds continue moving between Europe and Asia, while ships cross the waters connecting continents together. Calls to prayer rise above rooftops where church bells once echoed through Byzantine mornings. Seagulls circle above harbors that have watched Romans, Byzantines, Venetians, Ottomans, and countless travelers arrive across the ages. The city continues breathing, and perhaps that is what makes Constantinople so haunting even now. Most ancient empires vanished completely. Their capitals became ruins abandoned to silence and dust. Yet Constantinople survived by transforming itself again and again across generations. It endured because the place itself remained too important, too beautiful, too deeply connected to the movement of the world to disappear entirely. Even after conquest, the city continued shaping history. Ottoman sultans ruled from its hills. Traders still carried goods across its waters. Scholars, pilgrims, soldiers, poets, and wanderers all continued arriving beneath its skyline searching for opportunity, meaning, or simply wonder. The city adapted to every new age while quietly preserving fragments of the worlds that came before. And somewhere within modern Istanbul, the memory of Byzantium still lingers softly beneath the surface. Sometimes it lives within ancient churches hidden among crowded districts. Sometimes within old sea walls weathered by centuries of storm. Sometimes within stories passed from generation to generation about emperors, sieges, cathedrals, and the final night when the old empire faded into history. The past never truly leaves this place. It simply becomes quieter. Perhaps that is why human beings remain endlessly fascinated by cities like Constantinople. They remind us that civilizations are not permanent, yet neither are they completely lost. Empires rise with enormous confidence, believing their power will last forever. They build walls, monuments, palaces, libraries, and cathedrals as though history itself can be held still through stone and ceremony. But time continues moving. Kings disappear, armies vanish, borders change, and yet something deeper often survives beyond politics or conquest. Memory, atmosphere, the feeling of lives once lived beneath certain skies. Late at night, if you stand beside the Bosporus while the city lights shimmer across the water, it becomes easy to imagine the older world still resting quietly beneath modern Istanbul. One can almost picture Byzantine ships drifting through the darkness, almost hear distant church bells carried faintly across the sea, almost see lanterns glowing beside ancient harbor walls while guards walk silently beneath moonlit towers. The city invites imagination because it has contained so many different versions of itself across time. Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, modern. Each layer remains resting gently upon the others like waves crossing the same water century after century. And perhaps there is something comforting in that thought. Civilizations may fade, but human stories continue flowing forward. Every generation inherits memories from those who came before, adding new voices to places already ancient long before their arrival. Constantinople understood this better than most cities ever could. It stood between worlds, between continents, between religions, between empires, between endings and beginnings. And even after its fall, the city continued watching the waters of the Bosporus beneath changing skies, carrying the echoes of countless lives into the future. So tonight, as the sea winds move softly through Istanbul and distant lights shimmer across the dark water, the old city still remains there somewhere beneath the modern world, quiet, enduring, dreaming beside the meeting place of two continents.